38 witnesses stood in the Charleston shipyard that October morning in 1867, watching flames consume what shouldn't have been possible to burn. The Meridian was a steel-hulled vessel, one of the first of its kind on the Atlantic coast, and steel doesn't burn like that. Steel doesn't melt at temperatures a simple fire should produce. Steel doesn't collapse inward in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, almost designed. Yet there it was, glowing orange and white, folding in on itself like paper in a campfire, and inside that inferno was Jonathan Ashford, the shipyard owner who 3 hours earlier had been very much alive and very much convinced he was untouchable. The thing about Charleston in 1867 is that it was a city trying to forget. The war had ended 2 years prior, slavery had been abolished, but the machinery of oppression doesn't dismantle itself overnight. Men like Ashford had simply adapted, finding new ways to profit from bodies they could no longer legally own. The shipyard employed 73 formerly enslaved workers, paying them a fraction of what white laborers earned, housing them in conditions that differed from slavery only in the technical absence of chains. Ashford had built his fortune on the labor of people he still referred to as property in private conversations, and in the fall of 1867, that fortune was expanding rapidly as post-war reconstruction created insatiable demand for ships. Among those 73 workers was a woman named Ruth, though that wasn't the name she'd been given at birth. She had renamed herself after emancipation, choosing something simple and biblical that white people wouldn't question. She was 29 years old, unusually tall for a woman of that era at nearly 6 feet, with hands scarred from years of metalwork and eyes that seemed to calculate angles and distances constantly, as if she saw the world in mathematical terms that others couldn't perceive. Her father had been a blacksmith in Jamaica before being captured and transported to South Carolina, and he had taught her everything about metal before dying when she was 16. Fire and iron were her languages, and she spoke them with a fluency that unsettled the white foreman who supervised her work. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. This story was deliberately erased from Charleston's official history. The records were sealed, the witnesses were paid to forget, and for 130 years, what really happened on October 12, 1867 was known only to the people who were there and to their descendants who passed it down in whispers. I'm showing you this because enough time has passed that the truth can finally be told without endangering anyone. But it's a truth that's going to make you deeply uncomfortable, and it should. If you're ready for that, stay with me. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. Let's see how many of you are brave enough to hear this through to the end. The Meridian was Jonathan Ashford's pride, his statement to the world that he had successfully transitioned from plantation owner to industrial magnate. He had invested everything in this ship, gambling that steel-hulled vessels would dominate the future of maritime commerce. The ship was nearly complete by early October, just weeks away from its maiden voyage to New York, and Ashford was hosting potential investors daily, showing off the craftsmanship, the innovation, the superiority of his enterprise. What those investors didn't see was the cost in human suffering that went into every rivet and plate. Workers labored 14-hour days in conditions that regularly resulted in severe burns, crushed limbs, and occasionally death. Ashford's response to workplace accidents was to dock the injured workers' pay for time lost and to threaten dismissal if productivity declined. Ruth had been working in the shipyard for 8 months when something happened that would set the final events in motion. A young worker named Samuel, barely 18 years old, made a mistake while carrying a sheet of heated metal. He dropped it, and the sheet struck another worker, a man named Isaac who was Ruth's cousin, one of the few remaining connections she had to family. The metal caught Isaac across the legs, burning through his clothes and deep into his flesh. The injury was catastrophic, the kind that, in that era before antibiotics and proper medical care, would lead to infection and likely death. Ashford's response was immediate and merciless. He fired both Samuel for incompetence and Isaac for being unable to work, refusing to pay for medical treatment, claiming that workers assumed all risks when they accepted employment. Isaac died 4 days later, his legs black with gangrene, his fever so high he didn't recognize Ruth in his final hours. She sat with him in the boarding house they called home, a converted warehouse where workers slept on pallets separated by thin sheets, and she listened to him cry out in pain that nothing could ease. In those 4 days, something changed in Ruth. Friends who knew her said later that she became very quiet, very still, and began spending her evenings doing something she'd never done before. She started reading, borrowing books from a freedman's library that had opened near the docks, books about chemistry and metallurgy and engineering. She asked questions of the few educated black men in Charleston who had technical training, questions about combustion temperatures and structural failure and the properties of different metals under extreme heat. One of those men, a teacher named Thomas Carver who had been educated in the North before the war, later testified that Ruth had asked him specifically about thermite. Did he know what it was? Did he know how it was made? Did he understand what happened when you combined aluminum powder with iron oxide? Thomas, who had studied chemistry at Oberlin College, had explained carefully, wondering why a shipyard worker would need such information. Thermite, he told her, was a composition that burned at temperatures exceeding 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to cut through metal like butter. It was used in welding and in warfare, and it was extraordinarily dangerous because once ignited, it couldn't be extinguished with water. In fact, adding water to burning thermite would cause explosive reactions. Ruth listened carefully, asked about the ratios of aluminum to iron oxide, asked about ignition temperatures, asked about how much would be needed to compromise a ship's structural integrity. Thomas remembered feeling uneasy, remembered asking Ruth why she wanted to know these things. She had told him she was curious about the welding process, wanted to understand the science behind the work she did every day. It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of intellectual curiosity that Thomas wanted to encourage in formerly enslaved people who were just beginning to access education. So he told her everything she wanted to know, including where one might obtain the components, not realizing he was handing her the technical knowledge to commit what would later be called industrial terrorism. Over the next 3 weeks, Ruth made careful preparations. She worked her regular shifts in the shipyard, showing no outward signs of what she was planning. But she began collecting things. Aluminum was used in the shipyard for certain specialized components, and small amounts went missing from inventory, never enough to raise alarms but enough that over weeks she accumulated nearly 6 pounds. Iron oxide was even easier. It was essentially rust, and rust was everywhere in a shipyard environment. She scraped it from discarded metal, collected it from beneath workbenches, gathered it in a small tin that she kept hidden in her boarding house room. She obtained magnesium ribbon, used as an ignition source, by trading food rations with a worker from another yard. And she studied the Meridian structure with the careful attention of someone planning something that required absolute precision. The ship's design had a vulnerability that Ruth identified through simple observation and her understanding of structural engineering. The keel, the central structural member that ran the length of the ship's bottom, bore most of the vessel's weight. Compromise the keel at 3 strategic points, and the entire structure would collapse. The keel was accessible through the bilge, the lowest internal part of the ship, reached through access hatches that workers used during construction. Ruth calculated exactly how much thermite would be needed at each point, estimated the time it would take for the reactions to weaken the keel sufficiently, and determined that the best moment would be during the midday break when most workers would be outside the ship, but when Ashford would likely be inside showing the vessel to potential investors, as he did almost daily. But here's where the story gets even darker. Ruth didn't want Ashford to simply die. She wanted him to know he was dying, wanted him to understand that his death was not accidental but deliberate, wanted him to spend his final minutes in terror, realizing that someone he had considered beneath notice had outwitted him completely. So she added an additional element to her plan, something that would ensure Ashford's presence inside the ship at the exact moment the thermite ignited, something that would trap him there as the vessel collapsed around him. On October 11th, the day before it happened, Ruth approached Ashford directly, something workers almost never did. She told him she had discovered a structural flaw in the keel, a crack that could compromise the ship's seaworthiness, and that he needed to inspect it personally before the investors arrived the next day. Ashford, who prided himself on micromanaging every aspect of his business, who couldn't tolerate the idea that something might be wrong with his perfect vessel, immediately demanded to know where this crack was located. Ruth described its position with technical precision, using terminology that impressed Ashford despite his prejudices. She told him the crack was in a section of the bilge that was difficult to access, that she had only noticed it because she had been working in that area on repairs, and that he should inspect it early the next morning before the workers arrived so as not to alarm anyone. Ashford agreed, but with a condition. Ruth would accompany him to show him exactly where the crack was located. She had expected this and agreed immediately. That night, she made her final preparations. She mixed the thermite carefully, combining the aluminum powder and iron oxide in the correct ratios, dividing the mixture into 3 portions. She concealed each portion in a metal container that would withstand the initial heat and direct the thermitic reaction downward into the keel. She attached magnesium ribbon to each container as an ignition source, with fuses calculated to give her exactly 4 minutes from ignition to reaction, Time enough to get off the ship, but not enough time for anyone to discover and extinguish them. October 12th dawned clear and cool, the kind of Charleston morning where the air smells like salt and the light turns everything golden. Ruth arrived at the shipyard at dawn, carrying her concealed thermite in a tool bag that attracted no attention. Ashford arrived 30 minutes later, irritated at having to inspect a ship he considered perfect, but too controlling to delegate the task to anyone else. They boarded the Meridian together, and Ruth led him through the ship's interior toward the bilge access. The ship was empty except for them, the other workers not due to arrive for another hour, and their footsteps echoed in the steel corridors as they descended toward the lowest levels. Ruth showed Ashford the location she had described, a section of the keel that was actually perfectly sound, and while he bent close with a lantern to inspect it, she placed the first thermite charge behind a support beam where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Ashford found nothing wrong, just as she knew he wouldn't, and turned to confront her with anger building. Before he could speak, Ruth was already moving to the second location, telling him she must have been mistaken about exactly where the crack was, that it must have been in the adjacent section. Ashford followed, his irritation growing, and Ruth placed the second charge while his back was turned as he examined another perfectly sound section of keel. The third charge was placed when Ruth suggested that perhaps what she had seen was not a crack but a discoloration in the metal, and could he look at this section here, just to be absolutely certain everything was sound? Ashford, now thoroughly angry, bent to look where she pointed, and Ruth placed the final charge directly behind him. Then she pulled out the box of matches she had brought and looked at Jonathan Ashford for a long moment before speaking. She said, and 3 separate witnesses who interviewed her years later confirmed these exact words, "Isaac died screaming your name. He died because you valued profit over human life. He died because you consider us less than human. And now you're going to die the same way, screaming and in pain, knowing exactly who killed you and why." Ashford's face went from confusion to comprehension to terror in the span of seconds, and he lunged toward Ruth, but she was faster. She struck the match and lit the first fuse, then the second, then the third, and then she ran. The interior of the ship was a maze of corridors and hatches, and Ruth knew every turn because she had helped build it. Ashford was behind her, shouting for help that wouldn't arrive in time, trying to follow her through passages he didn't know as well as she did. Ruth reached the main deck and jumped to the dock with 40 seconds remaining on her calculated timeline. Ashford emerged onto the deck 15 seconds later, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Ruth saw understanding there, saw the exact moment when Ashford realized that his death was inevitable and that a woman he had considered insignificant had orchestrated it with perfect precision. He tried to jump to the dock, but he was not as athletic as Ruth, and the distance was just slightly too far. He landed halfway, caught himself on the edge, and was pulling himself up when the first thermite charge ignited. The sound was not an explosion but rather a roar, like a furnace opening, and brilliant white light flared from the ship's interior. The temperature inside the bilge reached 4,000 degrees almost instantaneously, and the keel at that point began to melt. 5 seconds later, the second charge ignited, then the third, and the Meridian structural spine was compromised at 3 critical points simultaneously. What happened next was witnessed by 38 workers who had begun arriving for the day shift. The ship seemed to pause, as if considering whether to remain upright, and then it began to collapse inward. The steel plates of the hull buckled and folded, the deck cracked down the center, and the entire vessel began sinking even though it was in dry dock, simply falling apart from the inside out as its structural support melted away. Ashford, who had nearly pulled himself onto the dock, lost his grip as the ship lurched, and he fell backward onto the tilting deck. He tried to stand, to run, but the deck was at a 45-degree angle and rapidly getting steeper. The thermite was still burning, its white-hot core spreading, and the heat was so intense that anyone within 50 feet could feel it like standing too close to a furnace. Ashford's clothes began to smoke, then to char, and then, horrifyingly, he began to scream. The screams lasted for nearly 2 minutes, growing higher and more desperate as the fire spread and the ship continued its collapse around him. Workers stood frozen, unable to help even if they had wanted to, unable to look away from the spectacle of a man who had seemed untouchable burning alive in the ruins of his own creation. Ruth stood among them, her face completely blank, and when Ashford finally stopped screaming, when the fire had consumed enough of the ship that his body was no longer visible, she turned and walked away. She walked through the shipyard, through the streets of Charleston, and by the time the fire brigade arrived with water that would do nothing against thermite fire, Ruth had disappeared completely. The investigation began immediately, but it encountered problems from the start. The fire had been so intense that forensic examination of the wreckage was nearly impossible. What remained of the Meridian was a twisted mass of melted steel, and Ashford's body was never recovered, consumed entirely by temperatures that exceeded anything a simple shipyard fire should have produced. The authorities questioned workers, but their stories were remarkably consistent and remarkably unhelpful. They had seen Ruth and Ashford board the ship together, had seen Ruth emerge alone, had seen the fire start, had seen Ashford die. But none of them could explain how the fire had started or why it had burned so intensely. None of them mentioned thermite, because none of them knew what thermite was. Thomas Carver, the teacher who had explained thermite to Ruth, was questioned and realized immediately what must have happened. But when the investigator asked if he knew anything relevant, Thomas looked at the man's face, saw the barely concealed contempt for black testimony, and made a decision. He said he knew nothing. He said Ruth had been a curious student, but nothing more. And after the investigator left, Thomas went to his chemistry books and destroyed every page that mentioned thermite, burning them in his fireplace and scattering the ashes. If Ruth had used his teaching to kill a man who had killed others through negligence and cruelty, Thomas decided he would not be the one to betray her. Ruth was never found, despite extensive searches. Reward posters went up throughout Charleston and surrounding areas, describing a tall black woman with metalworking experience. But the black community closed ranks in a way that frustrated investigators who couldn't understand it and couldn't break it. Ruth had become invisible, protected by people who understood that what she had done was not murder, but justice of a kind the white legal system would never recognize or provide. Some said she went north to Philadelphia, where large communities of formerly enslaved people could absorb newcomers without questions. Others claimed she went west to the frontier territories where identity was fluid and past actions mattered less than present capabilities. A few insisted she went to sea, using her metalworking skills to find work on ships where crew composition changed constantly and no one asked too many questions about anyone's history. The truth emerged gradually over decades, pieced together from deathbed testimonies and private journals and letters discovered in attics long after their writers had died. In 1923, a historian researching post-Civil War industrial accidents discovered Thomas Carver's private diary, written in the last year of his life and left with instructions that it not be opened until 1950. In it, Carver described his conversations with Ruth, described realizing what she had planned, described his decision to protect her by destroying evidence and misleading investigators. His final entry read, "I do not know if what Ruth did was morally right, but I know it was the only justice Isaac would ever receive." The law protected Ashford. The law said he owed his workers nothing, that their lives and health were their own responsibility. If the law provides no justice, then justice must be taken. I regret only that I did not help her more directly. In 1945, a woman named Clara Washington died in Chicago at the age of 97. Among her possessions, her grandchildren found a journal written by someone else, someone who had signed entries only with the initial R. The journal described working in the Charleston shipyard, described Isaac's death, described the planning and execution of Jonathan Ashford's killing with technical precision and no apparent remorse. The final entry, dated October 15, 1867, 3 days after the fire, read simply, "I have done what I had to do. I have become what they made me. I do not regret it, but I can never return to who I was before. That person died with Isaac. What I am now is something else, something harder and colder and permanent. I will survive. But I will never be warm again." The journal made its way to the Charleston Historical Society in 1947, where it sat in archives for another 30 years before a graduate student named Angela Freeman discovered it while researching her dissertation on post-war industrial labor. Freeman, who was African American and from Charleston herself, recognized the significance immediately. She spent 5 years tracking down descendants of shipyard workers, collecting oral histories that had been passed down through families, cross-referencing official records with private testimonies. What she constructed was a complete picture of what had happened, documented and verified through multiple independent sources. Freeman's work was published in 1978 under the title Fire and Iron: Acts of Resistance in Postbellum Charleston. The book caused controversy, with some historians praising it as groundbreaking research and others condemning it as glorifying violence. The Charleston Historical Society debated whether to mark the site where the Meridian had stood, ultimately deciding against it due to pressure from descendants of Jonathan Ashford, who still had considerable influence in the city. But Freeman's work opened doors for other researchers, and over the next 20 years, Dozens of similar stories emerged from archives across the South, stories of formerly enslaved people who had used knowledge and intelligence and careful planning to settle accounts that the legal system would never address. The debate about Ruth's actions continues today. Was she a murderer who deserves condemnation? Or a freedom fighter who used the only means available to achieve justice? Did she cross a moral line that should never be crossed regardless of provocation? Or did the system that enabled Ashford's cruelty bear the primary moral responsibility? These are not simple questions, and they shouldn't be. Ruth became something dark in order to survive and to strike back, and that transformation cost her everything soft and human about herself. She lived, but at what price? She achieved revenge, but did it heal anything or simply perpetuate cycles of violence? What we know for certain is this: Ruth was brilliant. She understood chemistry and engineering at a level that most educated people of her era didn't approach. She planned methodically over weeks, accounting for every variable, executing with perfect precision. She demonstrated capacities that the society of 1867 insisted black people, especially black women, simply didn't possess. And in doing so, she forced a reckoning with the lie that had sustained slavery and its aftereffects, the lie that some people were inherently inferior, inherently incapable of the intelligence and agency that white society claimed as its exclusive domain. The site where the Meridian stood is now a parking lot in downtown Charleston, unremarkable except for a small memorial plaque placed in 2003 by community activists. The plaque doesn't name Ruth or describe what really happened, but it acknowledges that a significant event occurred there, an event involving labor rights and racial justice. If you visit Charleston and ask local historians about it, most won't know the details. The story was too uncomfortable, too complicated, too disruptive of simple narratives about the past. But now you know. You know that in October 1867, a woman decided she had had enough, used knowledge as a weapon, and disappeared into history carrying a burden that would have destroyed most people. What do you think? Was Ruth justified? Should we honor her intelligence and courage? Or condemn her for taking a life regardless of circumstances? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this fascinate you, stories that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about history and justice and the things people become when systems fail them, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this, stories that were buried deliberately, stories that need to be told. See you in the next one.